How many of you heard of George Duckwitz? Nobody? Nobody's ever heard of Mr. Duckwitz? George Duckwitz was a Nazi. He was fairly high up in the Nazi party in Germany during World War II. Politician. He was so high up that after Germany invaded Denmark, and it took, what, 2 hours? Something like that, to defeat the Danish army. He was placed second in command of the governorship of Denmark. Mostly because he had done business for decades in Denmark before the war. So he knew the Danes, he knew most of the politicians, he knew most of the big business people. And Hitler had decided, out of what I don't know, that the Danish people were Aryans and thus they should be treated well. So even though they conquered them, they allowed their king to stay on the throne. They allowed them to continue flying their flags. They allowed their people to continue running their businesses as normal. And they allowed the Jewish people in Denmark, well, 7,800, to go about their business. Until one day, the word went out that they were going to round up all the Jews. So the German High Command contacted the governor of Denmark and told him. He was a very, very, very high-ranking Nazi. And he went to his second in command, George Duckwitz, and told him, ships will be arriving on this date at these ports. Troops will flood out into the cities of Denmark, mostly Gestapo, but just regular troops as well. And they will round up all of the Jews in Denmark on this specific date. Now you would assume he would tell him that because being one of the second in command, it's his job to organize it and everything. Except that this governor knew Duckwitz and knew what he would do instantly with that information. And George Duckwitz did exactly what was expected. He instantly went to one of the most prominent rabbis in Denmark. I mean, he left the governor's office to go straight to this rabbi and told him what was coming. He then went to several other prominent Jewish leaders and to several Jewish community centers and told all of them. And then that's when the miracle of Denmark occurred. And it's a sad thing that it is a miracle. See, most of the 7,800 Jews, about 7,000 of them, grabbed their belongings. Nazis had already rounded up Jews in Poland, France, well, everywhere they went. So they knew what was coming. So they grabbed all their stuff. And he said it was not unusual to see them walking down the street wearing 4, 5, 6 layers of clothing and carrying several bags. Because that was the only way you could get your stuff out. But they didn't know where to go or what to do. A little known part of history is that most other nations, even knowing what was going on, said to the Jews, "We don't want you here." America even turned away a shipload of Jews at one point. George Duckwitz knew this. And as part of his duties, he had to travel to Sweden, which was neutral. So right after he warned the Jewish community, he boarded a ship and sailed instantly over to Sweden. went to their high government officials, told them the situation, and said, will you please take in about 8,000 Jews? And they said yes. He jumped back on a ship, sailed back to Denmark, went around again to all the Jewish leaders and communities and told them. So all of these people grabbed all their belongings and started heading for port cities. Well, let me tell you, because here's where the miracle starts. Story of one Jew. He was working in a factory, just on the line, doing his job. Somebody came up to him and said, I'm surprised you're here. He said, what are you talking about? Haven't you heard? The Nazis are coming to round your people up. He left work right then and there, got on board the train that takes him back to his home. He's sitting there staring out the window. He said his mind was numb. Didn't know what to do. Where am I going to go? I got a wife. I got children. I got to get them to safety. I don't know what to do. The conductor, walking down the train, stopped and said, well, you're heading home early. Are you sick? He said, no, I'm a Jew. The conductor right away said, where are you going to hide? I don't know. I've got a wife and 3 kids. My house is big enough. Here's the key. Go get them and go there. 7,000 families. The Danes took them in. One woman said at one point she had keys to 4 different houses. A lot of Jews grabbed trains, headed to port cities, got off at the station and just stood there. They didn't know what to do. They said there was this one little port, a fishing town. Most of the fishermen with their families lived in little cottages that were barely big enough for them. They knew what was going on. They went to the station. Some of those fishermen took in 2, 3, 4 families to hide them until the tide and the moon was right, and they could put them on board their ships and sail them to Sweden. Others arranged transportation of various kinds. But all across Denmark, Jewish families and individuals were taken in, were hidden, sometimes for months, until transportation could be arranged. It's the miracle of Denmark. They were the only nation that did that. Most other nations, well, a lot of their government officials were complicit in the rounding up of Jewish families. Many of them were tried later for war crimes. There was this one large bookstore that would put a book of a specific philosopher in the window display. If it was there, that said it's safe, come in. Jewish families would go in there and they'd be hidden in the back warehouse area for weeks, for months. 600 people were channeled through that bookstore alone to safety. That bookstore was right across the street from Gestapo headquarters. Every one of these Danish families knew they were putting their lives of themselves and their families online. They got about 7,000 of them out. 800 couldn't make it. Many of those were old or in hospitals. One hospital, by the way, used its facilities to help about 1,000 get to safety. But of those others, 800, they were rounded up. They were sent to a concentration camp, and here's something most people don't realize. Not all concentration camps were death camps. Most concentration camps were slave labor camps. They captured the old, the weak, the sick, and sent them to slave labor camps. But once you weren't able to do your work anymore, then the Nazis sent you to a death camp. The Danes knew that. And the Danish government pestered the Nazi government until they found out exactly which camp the Danish Jews were sent to. And then once they knew, they broadcast it to all the people in Denmark. And people, even though there was massive food shortages, donated tons of food to be shipped to those Jews in the concentration camps so that they could stay healthy and maybe survive the war. Of the 800 that was sent, I think it was something like 750 came home. And by the way, the Danish officials knew what the German officials were like. Very officious. Everything must be documented. Paperwork, 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 paperwork. So any food parcels they sent, they made the receiving officers sign return receipts. It's a little bit harder to steal the food if you've signed a receipt for it. One last miracle happened after the war was over. Those 7,000, almost 800 Jews came home. And were celebrated. People came out of their streets, out of their house into the streets to welcome them home. More than that. Oh, it gets better. They came home to find that their homes were intact. Most other countries, as soon as they were transported to enslavement camps, people looted the houses. And then somebody would take over the house. They came home, found their houses intact. More than that. Several people reported that their house had been cleaned. More than that, a couple of people reported that their house had been cleaned and painted. Because somebody wanted to upkeep the house for them while they were gone. They were gone for a couple of years. And those who owned businesses, their business was still there waiting for them. Their employees kept the business going. Took only their own salaries out that they were earning before, and any profit they deposited it into a bank account to be held for the owner when he got back. They came home to their life. No other country did such a thing. It is the miracle of Denmark, and it is sad that it is the miracle of Denmark. Nobody else did that. Now that's not to say in other nations Jewish people weren't smuggled out, they weren't helped, they were. But not on such a grand scale. Not on a scale where the entire country decided, you know what? We're not going to let this horror happen. We are going to stand up and say no to this. And the Germans knew what had happened. They had raided community centers beforehand. They had captured records. They knew how many Jews were in the country. They knew where they lived. They knew where they worked. They knew that there should have been 7,800, and when they got there, they knew there were only 800. They knew what the Danish people had done. It took the whole nation to do that. It would have to. And they didn't do anything about it. No reprisals. Didn't dare. This is a nation that bands together. What do you think are going to happen if you really get them mad? But what it also teaches us is what happens when a nation turns a blind eye. You know, the Nazis didn't just suddenly appear one day as a huge, powerful force They were a political party to begin with. Weren't even that powerful. By the way, I should mention, because it isn't one of those things, again, that most people don't realize, Nazi stands for National Socialist. They were socialist. They believed in the teachings of Karl Marx. A lot of people were socialists back then. So at first, nobody paid that much attention to them. They denounced the Jews. A lot of people were anti-Semitic back then, all over the world. So at first, nobody paid any attention. They got some thugs to join their party who would beat people up that disagreed with them too much. I hate to say it, but in many parts of the world, politics is a violent business, and was in the 1930s. So nobody actually thought too much about it when they started attracting thugs. And then they started winning elections here and there. And they decided they needed to run for the national chancellorship. And they looked around for somebody within their party who could be their leader. And they decided they didn't have anybody. And then two members of the party were sitting in a beer house one day. And this young ex-lieutenant from World War I stood up, or corporal, excuse me, stood up and started giving a rousing speech about how much better the German people are than everybody else and how we need to stand united. It was incredibly rousing. And they went up to him and said, "Have you ever thought about joining the National Socialist Party? We'd like to run you, Mr. Hitler, as chancellor." So he joined, and he gave speeches, and he rallied support, and he got elected, and he started changing rules and laws to get things to run a bit better. Some of the first laws he changed were the ones that made Germany obey the treaty they signed after World War I. They weren't allowed to do a lot of things industrially, and it was holding back their economy. So he didn't exactly pass laws to break those, but he ignored them. And the German people were happy, because their economy was starting to boom. Sure, he was building tanks and artillery pieces and guns and uniforms and all kinds of stuff he wasn't legally supposed to be making, but the economy was doing great. Factories were producing all kinds of stuff suddenly. Farms were working better. And the things he started saying in his speeches, they started getting a bit more, what's the word? Psychopathic? You know, started blaming all kinds of groups for the problems in the world, the immorality, and that they must be removed. It wasn't, by the way, just the Jews, gypsies, Poles, people with mental or physical disabilities, you name it. Basically anybody that wasn't like him. Blonde hair, blue-eyed, tall Aryan. Oh, wait a minute. He's short, brown hair, brown-eyed. Why is my phone on? Why is the salesperson calling me? Especially from somebody whom I've already told, take me off your list. Well, the things he started doing started becoming more of a tyrant, destructive, controlling. And then he launched his army into war. And as he started conquering, he started becoming more of a dictator. The rules started getting stricter. And that's when the roundups began. All those people he had spent several years denouncing started going to enslavement camps. Now, the amazing thing about all this is that the people of Germany just sat by quietly and let it happen. The Nazis at any point were maybe 20% of the population. They weren't even the vast majority of the army. Most of the army, especially the officer corps, hated the Nazis. Nazis were political appointees who often were placed over top of trained generals who knew what they were doing. They were making decisions based on political concepts. We need to kill off our enemies. Whereas the military thought, no, first we need to win the war. But they never said anything. They never did anything. The vast majority of the army probably would have followed the generals. But they went along. Even while they knew incredible evil was being perpetrated in their name, the vast majority of the people of Germany let it happen. The vast majority of France. Some were complicit, some resisted, and most just tried to ignore it all and go about their lives. Even when people were rounded up, they just tried to ignore it. Somebody once asked General Patton how he defeated the German Rommel. He said, simple. I read his book. Rommel had written a book on tank tactics. Patton read it and knew what Rommel was going to do. Hitler had written a book called Mein Kampf, in which he detailed the extermination of everybody he thought needs to be gotten rid of in the world. And that it was up to the Nazis to conquer the world, because that would bring world peace for the survivors. And yet a lot of people were stunned and amazed to find out that Hitler wanted to conquer the world. A lot of people were stunned and amazed to find out that he wanted to kill people off. Why? We never saw it coming. Should have read his book. Should have listened to his speeches. Yeah, but that's history. World War II, that was the 40s. That's almost like 70 years. I mean, please. What can we learn from that today? Well, you might learn this lesson. Listen to people. They'll tell you their intentions. Whether it's in a personal, one-on-one relationship or listening to a world leader. How many world leaders, in the Middle East especially, have gotten up recently, in the past year, 10 years, 20 years, and said, we need to exterminate all of the Jews. And if they had the chance, they would do it. How many world leaders have stood up and given speeches in which they have said that they need to dominate to control, because that's how you bring about prosperity and peace for everyone. Well, at least for those who are in control. People stand up and tell you their intentions, and then the people of the world sit back and watch. Wait until the atrocity has been committed, and then take action. And I'm not just talking about us, the United States. I'm talking about the citizens of those nations. The citizens of Germany sat back and watched while atrocities were committed. There are atrocities being committed all over the world right this second. In South America, in Central America, in Africa, in the Middle East, Asia, Europe, everywhere. Being committed by a very few, by a very small portion of the population, and being allowed because the vast majority of the population does nothing. They don't protest, they don't denounce, they don't rise up and take action to stop it. They just stand there and watch. Or, is more likely, they turn their backs so they don't have to see. What can I, one man, do in the face of such atrocities? Well, when the atrocity has begun, it's very difficult. You want to stop an atrocity, stop it at the beginning. You see something horrible happening, stand up and denounce it. Other people will join you. Often what it takes is one person of courage and moral conviction to stand up and say, this is not right. And other people will join in. It may take a concerted effort of the entire nation to change it. It may take a slow grassroots movement. It'll never start until that first person stands up and says, this is not right. This must stop. We keep hearing about how we shouldn't blame all of Islam for the actions of a few extremists. I'm going to blame all of Islam. Because what are the rest of them doing? When those extremists fly airplanes into buildings and kill several thousand people, did we see many Muslims stand up and say that is an outrage and morally wrong? Did we see many people saying they're the ones that did it? They're right here, come get them. No, you don't have to come get them. We're going to take care of them. Do you see many of them, even to this day, going up to some of these radical clerics and saying, what you're doing is wrong? You need to stop? It is the same as the rise of Nazism. The vast majority of Germans did not believe, but they stayed silent, and that makes them complicit. They were partners in the crimes. Silent partners, but partners nonetheless. At what point do you stand up? The day for it.
Sorry.
We're all just so popular that everybody's trying to get a hold of us. That's the question that has to be asked. Like I said, Once the atrocities are happening, it takes much more effort to stop it. It takes much more effort to try to hide people, to protect them, to get them to safety. But to stand up when the rhetoric starts, to say that is wrong, I will not allow that to be said. That is actually more powerful. Because evil likes to work in darkness. And don't doubt this. I am talking about evil. Enslaving of other people, that's evil. Murdering of other people, that's evil. Tyranny, destruction of people, that's evil. Evil likes to work in the dark. It does not like to be dragged into the light of day and have everybody see it. By standing up when you first hear it and saying, no, that is wrong, you are dragging it into the light. You are making everybody look at it, and it will shy away. It may go underground and try to hide, but that's better than gaining power. And it may continue to try to spread its ideas. But you continue to stand in the light and say, this is what is right. This is what we should do. Teach the opposite. All it takes, as the old saying says, for evil to flourish is for good people to do nothing. We see that all over the world right this minute. And we see in our own country rumblings. Rhetoric is being spoken. Hate-filled, destructive rhetoric. We are at the beginnings in lots of little ways all over the country. If you hear it, denounce it for what it is. Oh, you'll be seen as intolerant because you're denouncing that group. Okay, I'm intolerant of evil. Take that badge proudly. I'm intolerant of those who would hurt. I'm intolerant of those who would murder. I'm intolerant of those who would enslave. I'm intolerant of those who would destroy. I proudly proclaim, I'm intolerant. Now what are you going to do with me? I'll wear the t-shirt. Evil starts in the heart of man and woman. And it grows by our words. It also is stopped by the love that is in our hearts and the word and actions that we take.